The heavy, suppressed pistol slipped from my trembling fingers, hitting the metal floor grating of the subterranean server room with a deafening, echoing clatter. The cold blue light from the massive fiber-optic relay illuminated the absolute, paralyzing nightmare sitting casually in the leather command chair. Victoria Sterling. She was wearing an immaculate, tailored white suit. There wasn't a single drop of ocean water, soot, or blood on her. She looked exactly as she had 10 years ago when she locked me in a white room and turned my mind into a living hard drive. My lungs completely seized. The sheer, overwhelming psychological terror of my childhood violently crashed over me, instantly freezing the blood in my veins. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I was suddenly 10 years old again, trapped in the dark, waiting for her heavy footsteps. "Hello, Liverbird," Victoria purred, her dark eyes locking onto mine with absolute chilling triumph. She didn't even glance at the weapon I had dropped. "Did you really think I would let you keep the cipher?" Before the paralyzing shock could completely drag me under, Camilla moved. She didn't hesitate. She didn't ask questions. She stepped entirely in front of me, using her body as a flawless, impenetrable shield, completely blocking Victoria's line of sight. Camilla raised her tactical sidearm, the red laser sight cutting through the blue server lights and planting itself dead center on Victoria's forehead. "Step away from the terminal, Victoria," Camilla commanded, her voice dropping into a register of pure, lethal, absolute zero. The Alpha Queen wasn't just defending her empire, she was defending her gravity. "Or I will finish what the ocean started." Victoria simply smiled, leaning back comfortably in the heavy leather chair. "Oh, Camilla, always so dramatic," Victoria sighed, completely unbothered by the loaded weapon aimed at her head. "You really should be thanking me. Julian thought he was so brilliant, leaking my location on the oil rig to the European syndicate. He wanted me dead so he could claim the Black Ledger without opposition. So, I simply gave him what he wanted." "You faked your death," Camilla stated, her fingers slowly tightening on the trigger. "I utilized a tactical withdrawal," Victoria corrected smoothly, her fingers lightly tapping the biometric keyboard of the mainframe. The explosion wiped my tracking signature completely off the global grid. It allowed me to operate in the shadows, anticipating Julian's move. I knew he would corner you in the crypt, and I knew, given your predictable Vance paranoia, you would bypass the physical vault and head straight for the decentralized relay in the tunnels. She finally looked past Camilla's shoulder, her dark eyes finding mine. I just needed to wait for my daughter to deliver the other half of the key. I violently flinched at the word daughter. It felt like a physical strike. I felt Camilla's left hand reach back blindly, her cold, strong fingers wrapping fiercely around my wrist. Her grip was a desperate, burning anchor, forcefully pulling me out of the traumatic spiral. "I have you," her touch communicated silently. "You are completely mine, not hers." "She isn't giving you anything," Camilla hissed, her body radiating an overwhelming, protective fury. "The Black Ledger is locked, and you are completely trapped in this bunker." Victoria let out a soft, mocking laugh. "Am I?" "The European Syndicate Vanguard is currently breaching the estate above us. They are under the impression that Nadia murdered me. If I don't transmit the decryption sequence to their command terminal in the next 3 minutes, they will pump nerve gas into this entire tunnel network." Victoria stood up slowly, her immaculate white suit glowing eerily in the blue light. "I have the terminal. You have the Vance biometric sequence. Nadia has the cipher." Victoria calculated coldly. "We unlock the ledger together. I take the European files, you take the Asian markets, and we leave Julian to the Vanguard. Or we all die in the dark. It is a very simple business transaction, Camilla." "Nadia is not a transaction," Camilla snarled, taking a slow, calculated step forward, keeping the weapon perfectly steady. "She is not your insurance policy. She is a sheen, Victoria countered ruthlessly, staring at me with profound disgust. I built her for one purpose. Come here, Nadia. Input the sequence. Earn your right to exist. The words hit me exactly as they had a decade ago, but this time, I wasn't alone in the white room. I looked at Camilla's back. I saw the slight, almost imperceptible tension in her shoulders. I remembered the pitch-black stone cabin, the heavy wool blanket, and the absolute burning devotion in her eyes when she told me we would dismantle the power structure. I took a deep breath, the freezing air of the server room filling my lungs. The terrified 10-year-old girl finally vanished, completely replaced by the survivor who had brought down the underground auction. I screamed out from behind her, walking slowly toward the glowing terminal. "Nadia, no!" Camilla yelled, her voice laced with perfectly calculated, theatrical panic. She kept her gun trained on Victoria, but she didn't physically stop me. "Good girl," Victoria smiled, stepping aside to let me access the keyboard. "You always were obedient when the consequences were severe enough." I stood in front of the massive, glowing screen. The prompt demanded the 256-character alphanumeric sequence, the key to $1 trillion of global blackmail, the key to absolute power. I placed my hands on the keyboard. I didn't look at my mother. I looked entirely at the reflection of Camilla in the dark glass of the monitor. "I'm sorry, Camilla," I whispered softly. Then, my fingers began to fly across the keyboard with blinding speed. Victoria stepped closer, her eyes locked greedily onto the screen as the complex, quantum-generated characters began to fill the prompt box. She was completely mesmerized by the culmination of her life's work. But Victoria had made one massive, fatal miscalculation. She had locked me in a room for years to memorize a cipher. She believed I was nothing but a biological hard drive. She completely failed to realize that spending 14 hours a day analyzing quantum code had turned me into a brilliant, highly adaptive system architect. I wasn't typing the decryption cipher. I was typing the Vance mainframe absolute zero-day purge sequence, a highly classified destructive code I had deduced by reverse engineering the syndicates' firewall architecture during our time in the underground. "Wait," Victoria frowned, leaning closer to the screen as the final 50 characters began to form. "That isn't the Sterling sequence. The algorithm is inverted. Nadia, stop!" She reached out to grab my hands, but Camilla moved faster than lightning. Camilla didn't shoot Victoria. The gunshot would have triggered the Vanguard's acoustic sensors above us. Instead, Camilla holstered her weapon, lunged forward, and slammed her heavy tactical boot directly into the side of Victoria's knee. The sharp, sickening crack of bone echoed through the server room. Victoria shrieked in pain, collapsing onto the metal grating, completely losing her elegant composure. I hit the final execute key. Instantly, the soft, ambient blue light of the massive fiber-optic relay violently shifted to a blaring, aggressive, flashing crimson red. Heavy, mechanical sirens began to wail deep within the concrete walls. "Warning!" A synthesized, automated voice echoed through the room. "Absolute zero-day purge initiated. Deleting cloud servers. Permanent data erasure in progress." "No!" Victoria screamed from the floor, her immaculate white suit stained with dirt and grease as she desperately tried to drag herself up toward the keyboard. "You stupid, ungrateful child. You're burning $1 trillion. You're burning the empire." I stepped back from the terminal, looking down at the woman who had tormented my entire existence. I felt absolutely nothing for her. "I'm not burning the empire, Victoria," I said, my voice completely steady and entirely free of the past. "I'm burning your cage." Camilla grabbed the heavy titanium chair and violently smashed it against the primary interface terminal. The screen shattered in a shower of sparks, permanently physically severing the relay from the cloud. The purge was now completely unstoppable. The black ledger was turning into digital ash. "We need to move!" Camilla yelled over the blaring sirens. "The vanguard will be here in less than 2 minutes." She grabbed my hand, her fingers intertwining tightly with mine. We ran toward the heavy, reinforced glass door of the server room. As we crossed the threshold, Camilla slammed her hand against the external biometric lock. The massive steel door whisked violently and slammed shut, the heavy deadbolts engaging with a definitive, echoing thud. We locked Victoria Sterling inside the dying server room with the ashes of her failed ambition. We sprinted blindly through the flooding, dark maintenance tunnels, the red emergency lights strobing violently overhead. The sound of heavy explosives detonating above us meant Julian and the vanguard were tearing the estate apart, completely unaware that the prize they were killing each other for no longer existed. "There is an old drainage grate at the end of this corridor," Camilla yelled, pulling me forward as the water level in the tunnel began to rise to our knees. "It leads directly to the cliffside facing the ocean." We pushed through the freezing, stagnant water, our lungs burning with exertion. Finally, the tunnel ended at a massive, rusted iron grate. Faint, gray morning light was filtering through the bars, carrying the smell of salt and fresh pine. Camilla aimed her sidearm at the rusted locking mechanism and fired 2 suppressed shots. The lock shattered. Together, we kicked the heavy grate open and violently spilled out onto the rocky, jagged cliffside. We collapsed onto the wet stones, completely exhausted, gasping for the fresh, freezing morning air. The storm had completely passed. The early morning sun was just beginning to break over the dark horizon of the Atlantic Ocean, casting a brilliant, warm, golden light across the violent, crashing waves below. I lay on my back, staring up at the clearing sky, my chest heaving. The nightmare was over. The Black Ledger was gone. Julian and Victoria were trapped in the ruins of the Vance estate, soon to be entirely dismantled by the European syndicate. Suddenly, Camilla shifted. She crawled over the wet rocks, straddling my waist, her knees pressing into the stone on either side of my hips. The morning sun caught the pale blonde strands of her damp hair, turning her into a breathtaking, radiant silhouette against the dawn sky. The blood, the dirt, and the exhaustion couldn't hide the absolute, overwhelming devotion burning in her glacial blue eyes. She didn't say a word about the money we had just burned. She didn't care about the empire she had just lost. She leaned down, her hands gently framing my face, her thumbs wiping away the grime and the lingering tears from my cheeks. "You are brilliant," Camilla whispered, her voice thick with an emotion so profound it made my heart physically ache. "You are completely, utterly magnificent, Nadia." I reached up, wrapping my arms fiercely around her neck, pulling her down. When our lips met in the golden light of the dawn, it wasn't a kiss of survival, and it wasn't a desperate vow in the dark. It was absolute, beautiful freedom. The kiss tasted of salt, rain, and the terrifying, breathtaking sweetness of absolute survival. When Camilla finally pulled back, her forehead rested against mine, her shallow breaths brushing across my lips in a soft, uneven rhythm. The blaring alarms and muffled explosions from the crumbling Vance estate were nothing but a distant murmur compared to the thunderous, synchronized hammering of our hearts. "The ledger is gone," I whispered, a brilliant, unbelieving smile breaking across my face despite the dirt and bruising. "Everything they used to cage us, it's all digital ash, Camilla." "Let it burn," she murmured, her voice dropping into a register of pure, aching intimacy that she had never used in any high-rise boardroom. She sat back on my thighs, her fingers sliding down my jawline to trail softly over the exposed skin of my collarbone, sending pleasant electric shivers directly to my core. The ruthless, untouchable Ice Queen had completely melted in the morning sun, leaving only the woman who had crossed an ocean of fire just to hold me. "I don't need a $1 trillion empire, Nadia," she whispered, her glacial blue eyes shimmering with a profound, unprotected vulnerability. "I have my gravity. I have you." I reached up, my hands finding the bare, smooth skin of her waist beneath the torn edges of her tactical undershirt. I pulled her down to me again, not for safety or warmth, but out of a deep, mutual necessity. We lingered there on the cold, wet granite cliffside for a few suspended, flawless minutes, simply consuming the reality of our freedom under the vast, clearing sky. But we couldn't stay on the rocks forever. The syndicate vanguard would eventually realize they had been chasing a ghost, and Julian's infrastructure would collapse in a matter of hours. We needed to disappear completely. Camilla stood up, pulling me to my feet in one fluid, graceful motion. She kept her hand tightly locked in mine, refusing to let go for even a single second as we navigated the steep, narrow cliff path leading down to a hidden rocky cove. Moored tightly against a natural stone pier in the deep shadow of the cliffs was a secondary interceptor boat, a sleek, low-profile carbon fiber vessel Elias had stationed there months ago as an absolute worst-case extraction asset. "Where to?" I asked, stepping onto the boat and gratefully accepting the heavy, dry wool blanket Camilla tossed over my shivering shoulders. Camilla manually fired up the silent electric hybrid engines, the navigation screens glowing with a clean, unmonitored digital map. She looked back at the smoke rising from the distant pines of her family estate, her expression entirely free of regret.
Elias secured a private villa on the Amalfi Coast under an unlisted offshore trust 3 years ago, she stated, a wicked, breathtaking smirk pulling at the corner of her lips as she turned the wheel, steering us out into the open, sparkling blue waters of the Atlantic. No ledgers, no syndicates. Just a terrace overlooking the Mediterranean, a massive library, and an endless supply of expensive wine. Sounds like a perfect trap, I teased softly, wrapping the blanket tighter around myself and leaning my head heavily against her shoulder as the boat accelerated smoothly away from the wreckage of our past. "The only trap you'll never want to escape," she murmured, pressing a warm, lingering kiss into the crown of my head. The journey across the open ocean was a long, exhausting, yet beautifully tranquil blur. For the first 12 hours, we took turns sleeping on the narrow leather berth in the lower cabin. When it was my turn to sleep, Camilla lay down beside me, her long legs intertwining with mine under the heavy blankets, her arm wrapped securely around my waist as if she were physically anchoring my mind against the lingering nightmares of the White Room. Every time I stirred in the dark, her grip would tighten slightly, and her lips would brush against my bare shoulder, instantly soothing me back into a deep, dreamless slumber. By the time the sleek vessel finally navigated into the deep blue, sun-drenched waters of the Mediterranean, the physical and psychological toll of the Vance dynasty had been entirely washed away by the sea salt and the sun. The villa was spectacular. Built seamlessly into the sheer terracotta cliffs of Positano, the estate was entirely invisible from the main coastal roads. It was a masterpiece of classic Italian architecture. Sweeping stone arches, vibrant bougainvillea cascading over ancient stone walls, and a massive, sun-washed marble terrace that looked as if it hung directly over the endless, glittering turquoise horizon. The interior was flooded with natural, brilliant light, a stark and beautiful contrast to the dark, suffocating steel bunkers and concrete vaults we had left behind. "Go take a real shower," Camilla ordered softly, her authoritative tone returning, though laced entirely with deep affection as she dropped our remaining tactical gear onto the tiled floor of the grand entrance. "The master bath has a panoramic view of the coast. I'll open a bottle of something ridiculously expensive." I smiled, leaning in to press a playful kiss to her cheek before heading down the sunlit corridor. The master bath was a sanctuary of white marble and gold fixtures. I spent an hour under the scalding, high-pressure water, literally and symbolically washing the last traces of smoke, gunpowder, and the sterling name off my skin. When I stepped out, I wrapped myself in an oversized, incredibly soft white silk robe I found hanging behind the door. I walked out onto the massive stone terrace. The afternoon sun was just beginning to dip toward the horizon, painting the Mediterranean sky in breathtaking ribbons of deep amber, soft violet, and brilliant gold. Camilla was already standing at the edge of the marble balustrade. She had changed into a flowing, sleeveless, emerald green silk dress that perfectly complemented the intense, crystalline blue of her eyes. Her pale blonde hair was loose, catching the warm, gentle coastal breeze. In her hand, she held 2 crystal glasses filled with a deep, ruby-red vintage wine. She turned as she heard my footsteps, her gaze dropping to take in the sight of me in the loose silk robe. A slow, intense heat completely replaced the cool elegance in her expression, her eyes dark with a heavy, intoxicating gravity. She walked over, handing me a glass, her fingers deliberately brushing against mine, sending a familiar electric jolt straight down my spine. "To the end of the world," I murmured, raising my glass. "To the beginning of ours," Camilla corrected softly, clinking her glass against mine with a clear, ringing chime. We drank in a deep, comfortable silence, watching the sun slowly sunk lower into the glittering sea. I stepped closer, sliding my free arm around her waist. Camilla immediately leaned into me, dropping her head onto my shoulder, her signature bergamot perfume mixing beautifully with the scent of the ocean air and the blooming jasmine on the terrace. "I spent my entire life looking at people as assets or liabilities, Nadia," Camilla whispered into the twilight, her voice cracking slightly with a rare, profound emotion. "My grandfather taught me that love was a systemic vulnerability. He told me that if you let someone inside your vault, they will eventually use the keys to bleed you dry." She turned in my embrace, setting her empty glass down on the stone balustrade. She reached out, her hands sliding inside the open collar of a silk robe, her bare palms resting flat against the warm skin of my chest, right over my racing heart.
But when I was suffocating in that tomb, when the air was entirely gone, I didn't care about the $1 trillion. I didn't care about outsmarting Julian. All I wanted was one more second of your breath in my lungs. She looked up at me, her blue eyes reflecting the brilliant, dying gold of the sunset. "You aren't my vulnerability, Nadia. You are my absolute survival." My throat tightened, tears of pure, unadulterated happiness prickling my eyes. I dropped my glass, wrapping both arms fiercely around her waist, pulling her bare thighs flush against mine as the warm Mediterranean wind whipped the silk of our clothes around us. "I love you, Camilla," I breathed against her lips, the words no longer carrying any weight of fear or hesitation. "More than life itself." "Show me," she growled softly, a sudden, fierce possessiveness darkening her gaze. She didn't wait. She grabbed the lapels of my robe, pulling me down into a deep, completely consuming kiss that entirely claimed the twilight. The kiss was an absolute consuming fire, igniting every single nerve ending in my body. It wasn't the frantic, desperate collision we had shared in the dark crypt, nor was it the violent, adrenaline-fueled clash in the stone cabin. This was a kiss of profound, undeniable ownership and absolute freedom. Camilla's hands gripped the lapels of my silk robe, pulling me flush against her as she slowly backed me across the warm marble of the terrace, moving us steadily toward the open French doors of the master bedroom. The warm Mediterranean breeze whipped the sheer white curtains around us like a dancing halo, completely cutting us off from the outside world. "You are so incredibly beautiful," Camilla murmured against my mouth, her voice a dark, intoxicating purr that sent a heavy rush of liquid heat pooling directly in my core. She backed my legs into the edge of the massive, custom-built canopy bed. With a slow, deliberate grace that entirely commanded the room, Camilla reached up and slid the delicate silk straps of her emerald dress off her shoulders. The expensive fabric pooled silently at her feet, leaving the brilliant, lethal alpha-queen completely laid bare in the golden hour light. My breath caught in my throat. She was a masterpiece of pale skin, sharp collarbones, and toned, athletic muscle, a beautiful, dangerous weapon that had completely surrendered its armor just for me. She stepped closer, her cold, elegant hands reaching out to untie the sash of my silk robe. She pushed the fabric off my shoulders, letting it fall to the floor to join her dress. When her bare skin finally pressed flush against mine, a soft, involuntary gasp escaped my lips.
The contrast between her cool skin and the burning heat radiating from my own body was violently intoxicating. Camilla gently pushed me back onto the massive expanse of the bed, following me down until she was hovering over me. The sheer dominance in her glacial blue eyes was completely eclipsed by a deep, reverent worship. "I have waited lifetimes for this," she whispered, her lips trailing agonizingly slow, burning kisses down the line of my jaw, moving lower to trace the sensitive column of my neck. I arched my back into the soft white linens, my hands instantly tangling in her pale blonde hair. Every press of her lips, every deliberate tracing line of her fingertips across my ribs felt like a sacred confession. We worshipped at the altar of our own survival, erasing every lingering scar of the Vance and Sterling empires with the absolute, consuming heat of our touch. When her hand slid slowly down the curve of my waist, her touch claiming me with a fierce, territorial devotion, the rest of the world completely ceased to exist. There were no syndicates. There were no bounties. There was only the rhythmic, crashing sound of the Mediterranean waves, echoing the violent hammering of our hearts, and the heavy, breathless gasps that filled the sunlit room as we entirely, perfectly lost ourselves in each other. 6 months later, the brilliant morning sun spilled across the terracotta tiles of the villa's expansive terrace, carrying the sweet scent of blooming lemon groves and fresh espresso. I stood at the stone balustrade, holding a warm ceramic mug looking out at the endless, glittering expanse of the Amalfi Coast. The dark circles under my eyes, the hypervigilance, and the deep, traumatic shadows of my childhood had completely vanished, washed away by 6 months of absolute, unbothered peace. We were ghosts. "You're up early," a smooth, dark voice murmured from behind me. I smiled, leaning back before I even turned around, 2 strong, familiar arms wrapped securely around my waist, pulling my back flush against a warm chest. Camilla rested her chin on my shoulder, her pale blonde hair loosely tied back. She was wearing a simple, unbuttoned white linen shirt and light trousers, a breathtaking, relaxed contrast to the heavily armored, matte black tactical gear and ruthless designer suits she used to wear like a second skin. "I was just listening to the ocean," I replied softly, turning my head to press a lingering kiss to her cheek. "Elia sent a secure ping on the emergency satellite channel this morning," Camilla stated, her tone remarkably casual for someone discussing the underground fixer. I didn't panic. The Nane didn't send a spike of adrenaline through my system anymore. "What did he say?" Camilla reached into the pocket of her linen trousers and pulled out a heavy, matte black encrypted burner phone. "The European vanguard finally finished dismantling the remnants of the Vance and Sterling estates," she said, her blue eyes looking out at the horizon with complete, unbothered detachment. "Julian's financial networks collapsed entirely without the Black Ledger to leverage his debt. He is missing, presumed dead by the syndicate, and Victoria's remaining loyalists were entirely purged in the power vacuum." She looked down at the encrypted phone in her hand, the last tether to a life of violence and corporate warfare. "The monsters are dead, Nadia," Camilla whispered, her arm tightening possessively around my waist, "and the world thinks we burned in the fire with them." I looked at the woman holding me, the alpha queen who had brought Wall Street to its knees, the woman who had walked into a suffocating tomb to save my life, had completely let go of her empire. With a fluid, graceful motion, Camilla tossed the heavy black encrypted phone over the stone balustrade. We watched it fall in a perfect arc, plunging silently into the deep, churning turquoise waters of the Mediterranean hundreds of feet below, disappearing forever. "No more ledgers," Camilla murmured, turning me around in her arms so we were entirely face to face. "No more ghosts," I agreed, a brilliant, radiant smile lighting up my face. Camilla's expression softened into that rare, devastatingly beautiful vulnerability that belonged exclusively to me. She reached into her other pocket, her fingers brushing against something small before she brought her hand up to frame my face. I used to think a legacy was going to be a $1 trillion vault built on fear and blackmail, Camilla said softly, her thumb gently tracing my cheekbone. But all of that was just ash waiting for a spark. She lowered her hand, taking my left hand in hers. She didn't drop to one knee, that wasn't who she was. The Alpha Queen didn't beg and she didn't follow traditions. She simply commanded the space, entirely and perfectly. She slid a sleek, heavy band of custom-forged, brushed platinum onto my ring finger. There were no massive, ostentatious diamonds, no corporate branding, just a pure, unbreakable circle of the strongest metal on Earth. "You are my legacy, Nadia," Camilla vowed, her voice trembling slightly with the sheer, overwhelming weight of her love. "You are my gravity. You are my sanctuary. You are the only empire I will ever need to rule." I stared down at the heavy platinum band shining perfectly in the morning sun, tears of absolute, profound joy finally spilling over my eyelashes. I looked up into the glacial blue eyes of the woman who had completely rewritten my destiny. "And you are mine," I whispered fiercely, rising onto my tiptoes. I pulled her down into a deep, passionate kiss. The Mediterranean sun warmed our skin, the ocean breeze carried the scent of jasmine, and the world, our world, was completely, perfectly safe. The nightmare was over, the game was won, and wrapped securely in the arms of the Arse Queen, I was finally entirely home.
And that is a wrap on Neon and Velvet. From the dark underground to that beautiful Italian sunset, Camilla and Nadia finally got the perfect happy ending they deserved. If you loved this journey, please hit that subscribe button so you don't miss our next series. And let me know in the comments, what was your absolute favorite moment of the entire story? Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you next time.